Hi everyone and welcome back. I hope you guys all had good Thanksgiving breaks, and this week we're going to be getting into our last content lecture, our last lecture at all of the semester. And today's topic is going to be going through some ethical issues in conducting research. Before I do that though, just some end of the semester announcements and reminders. So as a reminder, we're still going through the projects. Grades for project number 1 were posted a week or two ago. For project number 2, I got some of your guys' grades up over the break. The rest will be up today. And then project number 3, if you choose to complete it, will be due this Sunday at 11:59 p.m. And just as a reminder, there are 2 project options. You have to pick one of those. So you can only turn in one thing on Sunday. And you probably know this by now, but just to remind you again, you have to complete 2 out of 3 projects, and then if you complete all 3 projects, your lowest score will be dropped. Also, just taking another quick look at the schedule for this semester, so we really are in the home stretch now. We have this week where we'll talk about ethics. We have no required activity this week. There is what is in the syllabus and what I talked about last lecture as being a makeup activity, but I've decided to just open this up and make it an extra credit activity. So it's worth 5 points. If you missed an activity, those 5 points will go towards filling in that last activity. But if you didn't, they'll just go towards, your overall grade. So either way, you do the activity, you get 5 points, and it can either, fill in a grade deficit from a missing activity or, just fill in anywhere else. So it's just 5 points for the activity, but they're not required, so it's 5 points extra credit that can make up an activity. And then also this week, again, that project option number 3 is due on Sunday. And then we have our last week of the class after that. So the week itself, according to the course schedule, is short. It cuts off on Wednesday, I think, which is the 10th, or Thursday, which is the 10th. And that's not going to matter too much for you guys because it's going to be the exam week. So I'm going to be assigning the exam on Wednesday. Same thing as last time. The first 2 days I'll answer any questions you have about the material, so Monday and Tuesday. And then the exam will open up on Wednesday, and you'll have the rest of the time to complete it. The exam itself is going to be due on the Tuesday after that, so you actually have a full week to complete this thing, and that'll be during finals week the 15th. The reason you have a week is not that this exam is particularly harder, that you need a week. It's just that that was how the schedules lined up, and I didn't want to have it due on like a reading day or anything weird like that. So we have our final lecture this week, and then next week we have exam 2. Of course, if you have any questions about any of this, please feel free to reach out, and I'll be happy to answer them. Oh, also, and exam 2 is going to be exactly the same format as exam 1. So I'm not going to go through the whole format again here, but you should know what to expect at this point. And then, of course, next week when I assign the exam, I'll put up all the specifics again. And finally, since we're coming to the end of the semester, I'll ask you guys, if you haven't already, since I think they open today, please fill out course evaluations. There are 2 good reasons to do this. One is that I always read them, and I take your comments into consideration when I prep this class the next time around. So, let me know what worked, what could have worked better, especially now that we're doing things online and, it's a little unclear where we'll be over the next couple semesters also. So fill them out so that you can give me information about the class. As one reason. The other reason to fill them out is that I am an untenured professor. This means I go up for evaluation, and after evaluating me, they will decide whether to keep me on or fire me forever. And one of the things that gets counted in the tenure evaluation are my course evaluations. So if you like the class and you have 30 seconds to spare, just go through and give me a good rating, because that's helpful for me as well. All right, so with that, I'm going to get into the material for this week. This one is also a relatively short lecture. It used to be stuck to the end of a different lecture we did, and I just made it its own week this week. But I think, after Thanksgiving and going into finals, I don't like to give you guys too much to do in this little middle week. So today we're going to talk for a relatively short time about ethics in research. And the first thing I want to talk about are some just infamous examples of ethical violations in research. And these examples are why we have so much infrastructure around making sure that research is ethical today. Because people were doing these things, there was no oversight, and eventually, people started to realize, we need to make sure that researchers aren't actually, violating people's rights or doing anything horrible to them. So these are some examples of really, really terrible ethical violations in research throughout history. Possibly and probably the most infamous is the Tuskegee syphilis study. And in this study, researchers withheld a cure for syphilis from hundreds of black sharecroppers back in the 30s just to see what would happen when somebody had untreated syphilis. And it's really kind of mind-boggling today that anybody would even think that was a reasonable thing to do. But they did it, and it really went down in history as one of the most horrible things anybody has ever done in research. Because these people did not have any choice about whether to participate, and there were really horrible effects. They all died of syphilis. So that's one example. Another example, which is much more recent, was in the 70s, and it resulted in this book called Tea Room Trade. And in this example, somebody posed as a sort of lookout voyeur type person for gay men who are having sex in bathrooms in clubs in the 70s. Not only did he do that, but he also took down their license plate numbers, followed them to their houses, and posed as a mental health researcher to interview them later, and then wrote a book about it. So, we're not ranking things on a scale from bad to not bad, but nobody died in this one. But still, you can imagine it's such a huge violation of privacy, especially back when there was much less acceptance of LGBT anything. So, this is another one that really has gone down in history as just being a huge ethical violation. Okay, and then finally, another famous one here, the monster study. And this one was a study in which researchers were interested in stuttering. So they took a bunch of orphans, divided them into two groups, and made one of the groups of orphans into people who would stutter for the rest of their lives, just to study stuttering. So they had a bunch of kids who, had sort of horrible life circumstances already, and then made it so that they would stutter for the rest of their lives. So this is another thing where you can see researchers, no matter, what they were hoping to get out of it, they were going about it in a way that was really, really seriously hurting people and violating their rights. And so it's research like this that kind of turn people onto the idea that we need to have some sort of oversight into what researchers are doing just for the sake of generating knowledge, right, which is our goal in research. And so I give these examples mostly just to put in perspective what we do today and sort of why we have the processes that we do for evaluating the ethicality of research and what some of those considerations are that we consider when we're talking about research ethics. So in human subjects research today, which is what we're going to be talking about, so it's just research involving people in any way. There's different ethical considerations if you're doing research on lab rats or something, but research involving humans. There are a whole bunch of things that you need to consider when designing a study in order to make sure that you are treating people appropriately, as a researcher. And a really big one is voluntary participation. So something that all of those studies on the last slide had in common is that the people involved in the studies had no choice about whether they were going to be involved in the study. Nobody signed up to have any of those things happen to them. And so this is one of the really key considerations in research today, is that if you're going to be doing research on human subjects, you have to make sure that they are willing to participate. And with this one, the lines do get a little bit fuzzy sometimes, because you can imagine if you're out there doing social observation, you're just observing what's going on around you. It may be difficult to get voluntary participation because you're not telling people that you're doing research necessarily. But to whatever extent possible, it's really important to make sure that people are participating voluntarily, especially if they're participating in any sort of real substantial degree rather than maybe just, walking by, as you might in a more observational study. Another huge concern in ethics in human subjects research is harm to participants. And so as a general rule, a researcher should try to not harm the people who are involved in the study. And with most research, this is possible. But something to consider is that some types of research do involve kind of more sort of less clear forms of harm that may come to participants. So as an example, if a researcher was studying how emotional reactions to things influenced how people thought about a particular topic, you might be inducing emotions like sadness or anger. So you need to see how people function when they're feeling sad or angry, so you would need participants in your study to be sad or angry. Is this harm? So here you almost get into philosophical questions. Because lots of forms of research can cause people to experience discomfort of different kinds, especially, emotional discomfort if they're dealing with something that's distressing. There's also research that studies how people function when they're in pain, and often they'll do something like have somebody hold their hand in a bucket of ice water for 2 minutes, and that causes participants to feel pain. So the question here becomes, how do you do research while minimizing the total amount of harm participants can feel? And the goal is to do studies with what is called minimal and justifiable risk. So minimal means the least possible amount of risk that you could possibly have. So the least possible amount of harm or potential for harm. And justifiable means that the, amount of minimal harm that people are feeling has to be justified by what the study can give you. So if you're going to cause somebody to feel emotional distress as part of a study, if you're going to cause them to feel pain in their fingers by having them hold their fingers in a bucket of ice water, there has to be a really good and important reason for doing this. So part of the oversight of research is really evaluating that the amount of harm is both minimal and justifiable within any particular study. Another important component of this, which is somewhat related to voluntary participation, is that all participants in research studies have to be able to give informed consent to, experience whatever the study might bring them, and particularly whatever harm it might bring them. And informed consent is pretty much what it sounds like. They have to consent, so they have to agree to participate in the study, and they have to agree to participate in the study knowing what the study is likely to do to them. So that's the informed part. So you can't just ask people, will you participate in a study, and then stick their hand in a bucket of ice water without telling them that that's what's going to happen, because they're not consenting to experience pain for however long that lasts. But if you tell them that that's what the study involves and then ask them to consent, we consider that ethical because people know what's going to happen, they agree to do it, and the risks would be minimal and justifiable in order to, or they're justified based on, whatever good the study can produce through, science. All right, so voluntary participation and harm are two big ones. Another important consideration in human subjects research is anonymity and confidentiality. So anonymity means that nobody knows who the participants are, even the researchers themselves. And many studies involve the anonymous collection of data. A big example would be if you're doing some sort of survey. People click on a link, they fill out the survey, they never give their name, they never give any identifying information, and the only thing you have are their answers to survey questions that you can then use for data analysis. And that would be an example of research that's totally anonymous for the participants. There's no way that the researcher or anybody else could look at the information that's in that survey and figure out who the participants are. If anonymity isn't possible, confidentiality is key. And so confidentiality means that the researchers have in place a way to make sure that any identifying information they do collect never sees the light of day, and so that nobody will ever find out who the participants were outside of the researchers themselves. And so when thinking about anonymity and confidentiality, it's really important to consider sort of what types of information are collected about participants, and then also how that information will be stored and shared and disseminated. And especially in thinking about confidentiality, a researcher might have to be careful about what details of a study end up getting shared in the final published version, for example. And this is especially true if you're thinking about more qualitative data, where you often have a lot of really rich personal information about a small number of people. And you'd want to be careful that you didn't accidentally put enough information out there that somebody could read through the resulting study and figure out who it is you're talking about. These things also come into play often if you're working with an organization. And so, for example, I was part of a study once where we were using data from a particular police department, and we were mapping onto, mapping police activity onto attitudes about the police and some other things within the city where it happened. And we ran into some problems because, if you know what the city is, you know what the police department is, and then, we're sharing information about them that they didn't necessarily want shared. And so there's ways around that, and you can kind of find ways to take out identifying information in research, but it is something that needs to be considered and that may require changes to the research to protect participants in that way. A final concern in human subjects research is deception, and this one tends to be a little bit less prevalent in criminal justice research, but a lot of more psychological research involves deceiving participants about what the purpose of the study is. And it does show up in our research as well. So for example, there's research on things like stereotype threat, where if you remind people of stereotypes of themselves, it often causes them to feel uncomfortable or act in ways that are in response to thoughts about stereotypes about themselves. And so there's, for example, an interesting study where the researchers looked at Black and white participants. They brought up, stereotypes about crime and how people think about that, and then had the participants be accused by somebody who was doing the study of stealing a laptop. And they wanted to see if people would act differently after being reminded of those stereotypes. And they found that Black participants, after being reminded of these sort of negative stereotypes having to do with crime, acted more nervous being questioned, and it had nothing to do with their actual activities because they were all just participants in the study who were being accused baselessly. Whereas white participants weren't really, ruffled, obviously, by anything like that because there are no stereotypes in that direction. So anyway, the point here is that they were being deceived about the purpose of the study. They were just, told to come in. They didn't know that they were going to be accused of stealing a laptop. They didn't know that they were going to have negative stereotypes brought up to them. And this research was important because it showed that, if people are going to act differently under questioning simply because of fear of being stereotyped, that has implications for real life accusations and real life interactions with police, and it tells us a lot about the world. But it also means that participants had to be accused of stealing a laptop in that moment, which was an uncomfortable situation for everybody to be in, and they didn't know what was going to happen to begin with. So that's an example of a study using deception. So a key thing here, to bring this back to ethics in human subjects research, is that if participants are going to be deceived, they then need to be debriefed at the end. And just like harm to participants, that deception has to be justifiable within the confines of the study. And in the study that I just mentioned, they wanted to know how people reacted in the moment, after being faced with negative stereotypes. It wouldn't have been possible to tell them about all of this beforehand in informed consent, because that would have, prepared them for what was going to happen and changed how they were going to react. So deception would be considered, necessary and justifiable for the purposes of that study, and the emotional distress that they would experience would have been considered, sort of necessary and justifiable because of what the study can tell us about, some of the problems that you have when police actually go on things like nervousness in questioning somebody in an encounter. But bring this back to my actual point here. With the need for deception, it means that you have a problem in actually getting that informed consent. So in these cases, people who are overseeing research really have to think about, A, is the deception sort of justifiable? It's not going to result in a lot of harm. And then it's the researcher's duty to make sure that the participants know exactly what happened and why it happened after the study. So in that study, they would have to actually sit down with these people, talk to them about, why they were accused of stealing a laptop to begin with, what the purpose of the study is, what they hope to gain, and then provide them with any resources that they might need if they're, feeling upset or if anything bad happened because of the study. So in designing research, it's possible to include deception, but it's also really important to make sure that it doesn't have any negative effects on participants in the study. All right, so these are pretty much the key considerations in designing human subjects research that is ethical. And so we need people to voluntarily decide to participate in a study. We need to make sure that any harm to participants is minimal and justifiable, and that where possible, participants give informed consent. To make sure that all the information is anonymous or at the very least confidential, so that no one has the results of this study, embarrass them or hurt their social standing or do anything else to them in their lives after they take place in the study. And then deception needs to be really carefully considered, and participants need to be debriefed after the deception occurs. So this really leads us to the question of who decides whether research is ethical. And in universities and other big settings like this, the people who decide this are institutional review boards, or IRBs. And the sole purpose of an IRB is to review proposed studies and decide whether to approve them or not approve them based on the extent to which they protect or fail to protect the participants in these studies. A big part of IRBs is to ensure that all participants in the studies are able to consent, so that's your voluntary participation, and that they're giving this informed consent about the potential risks or harms of the study. And so the IRBs would consider everything on that last slide there and make sure that participants are, able to give informed consent and sort of know what they're getting into in participating in the research. IRBs also often have considerations for special populations, and by special populations, I mean populations that are more vulnerable than sort of your just typical adult. So children would be considered a special population because as important as it is to research children, children can't really consent to things in the same way that adults can. So for people who are doing research with children, it's really, really important to make sure that those children are protected. Another population that's considered a special population or a protected population in research are people who are incarcerated. And so in our field, this is a really, really big one. And while you can go into a prison and do research with the people who are incarcerated there, you can even give them a nice sheet of informed consent and say, this is what we're doing for the study, will you consent to it? You always have to be really, really careful, because you could imagine that if someone, is an inmate in a prison and they're brought out to meet researchers, you've got the prison guards, the COs, all standing around and sort of saying, will you participate in this study? Somebody who's in that position might not feel comfortable, saying that they don't want to participate if they feel that there's any pressure on them from the prison itself to do so. And then there's also questions about, what are their alternatives in the moment? Is there, are they going to participate in the study because, they fear that they'll be put in a bad situation, or they'll, have some other consequences if they don't. So as a researcher going into a prison to do work, it's really, really incredibly important to make sure that the people who are participating in the study are actually consenting to do so. So IRBs are very important in that they help to avoid any of the sort of ethical violations that we've been talking about, where people are not participating voluntarily, where they're being harmed in a way that's really too much or not justifiable, or where they're having information that might be shared in a way that they don't want. So this is a structure that history has shown us we absolutely need to have in place, because as important as it is to generate knowledge, you can't throw people under the bus to do so. But there are some issues with IRBs that are worth mentioning as well in practice. One is that the people who are on IRBs are typically not experts in every single field that they're considering. So people who work in IRBs are hired by the university to evaluate studies based on a whole bunch of different guidelines that exist. But you have sometimes people who are not experts in the field trying to evaluate proposed research by people who, have perhaps more reason or justification for a particular study design, than the IRB might see. There's also no oversight for the IRBs. So, here's who's watching the watchers. But sometimes what happens in a combination of these things is that studies get rejected for really, really, really sort of arbitrary or strange reasons, or the same study will be accepted by one IRB and rejected by another IRB. And they've actually done research on this, that the same study design will get accepted or rejected. And so some of it is kind of a crapshoot in terms of what gets through and what doesn't get through. So as a researcher, most researchers, you say IRB and they're all like that's kind of annoying. But in terms of thinking about the human participants as well, you might have study designs get through that actually aren't great, but there's just so much variation in what gets approved and what doesn't get approved that you might run into an issue there. And at the risk of, sounding like I don't care about human participants, when I say things that seem sort of arbitrary, I have had a conversation with an IRB in which we were conducting an anonymous survey through this major survey research firm, YouGov. They do all sorts of political polls and other things. And we were going to be asking people's attitudes about sex crime and some other stuff. And the IRB got really, really hung up on the fact that YouGov would have the email addresses of the people who responded to our surveys, and were concerned that it would be possible that someone would somehow hack into this major survey research firm's databases, make public the information from our survey in which we did not actually collect anybody's names, and that somehow that information would be used to embarrass participants. It's just pretty unlikely that that's going to happen, and anonymous survey research is done all the time. There's never ever problems like that. But you end up having a lot of email exchanges with people who are, maybe hung up on some unnecessary details. And so, yeah, the third thing here and the issue to talk about is that there's just not a lot of consistency. And something I think is interesting here is a study that I read that showed that depending on the ideological slant of a study, the same exact study design will be either approved or not approved, depending on whether the IRB sort of likes what the study is trying to show or doesn't like what the study is trying to show. So there's just not a lot of consistency. And, so IRBs are, doing something very important, But again, if you ask most people what they think of the IRB, they're going to roll their eyes. But one of the reasons I do like to start out with kind of talking about the history of this is that there really, really is a good reason to have IRBs, and the human participation, the human subjects' ethical considerations are really important and really serious and should be followed. And IRBs are currently the best way we have of doing that. So that's how studies either pass or don't pass when thinking about whether they're getting approval in terms of whether they're ethical. I will also, before I get there, I just want to talk about what navigating the IRB actually looks like if you're a researcher. And the short answer is that you fill out a whole lot of forms. And so most IRBs, there is something called a protocol, which is where you describe your study, describe every single thing you're going to do, and how you're going to do it. And these forms are usually somewhere in the neighborhood of like 20 pages, where you're just describing everything and you're showing in great detail that you are protecting the rights of participants. So again, really important thing to do. Please don't think that I don't think that. And if you end up doing the activity this week, I will ask you to actually take a look at one of those forms. But if you click through this link here, you can just find the list of different forms that Rutgers uses for their IRB. So there's a main protocol, which again is usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 pages. And depending on the type of research you're doing, you may need to provide additional information as well. So some IRBs, they'll have a regular research form, but then if you're doing any research that involves the internet, there'll also be an internet form. And so this is practically how universities and institutions try to ensure that there is no ethical violations in research. And many journals will ask that if you try to publish a paper with them, you show that you have gotten the appropriate approval for a study, which is a good thing. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about ethical considerations in human subjects research. The last thing I want to do here is just talk about a couple more other ethical considerations in research. And these are considerations that are true even if you do everything right in designing the study and you do it ethically with regard to your participants and get it approved. There are still things that it's important to think about. So one, what I'm calling this category here, is implications of research with ethical methods and good intentions. And I'm going to pick on one particular theory and line of research, but this could apply in many others as well. So over the last 10 or 20 years, there have been dozens and dozens of articles on hotspots policing, showing that hotspots policing is effective at reducing crime. So hotspots policing, as many of you guys probably know, involves sending police officers to hotspots of crime and having them police extra vigorously there. So they could be just spending time there, but they could also be doing other things in hotspots like, stopping more people or doing problem-solving policing, whatever the police department thinks is effective. But the one thing that all hotspots policing strategies have in common is that you're sending police officers to hotspots of crime, so locations in a city where many, many crimes happen. So far so good, right? We've done all these studies ethically, nobody's rights have been violated in doing these studies, and we have a bunch of research showing that we have an effective way of reducing crime. Well, the potential problem that you get when you send a bunch of police officers to hotspots of crime is that hotspots of crime are often concentrated in areas of disadvantage and areas with populations that are mostly people of color. So based on all of this research, the policy implication is that you should send more police in to more vigorously police poor people and people of color. And when you think about it this way, you kind of have to stop and really think through the ethical implications of research that was done in absolutely good faith and that, shows what they're hoping it would show, which is that hotspots policing reduces crime. And as I said before, I'm picking on this sort of one particular line of research not because I think any of these people had bad intentions or did the research badly, but it's one thing that I think really needs to be considered when using research and sort of making suggestions about how that research should be used. Just to throw out another example, there's other research that looks into risk assessment. And these risk assessment tools are often based on research and are used to decide whether somebody should be incarcerated or put on probation, or whether somebody should be let out of prison, and paroled instead. And every single risk assessment study, goes into it with really good intentions, and they really want to find the factors that are going to tell you, is somebody going to recidivate after they leave prison, or are they going to, just recidivate if they never go to prison? And so you can come up with this long list of factors and, come up with a prediction for how likely it is that someone's going to recidivate. But the way that different things are correlated with each other, oftentimes risk assessment tools like that are going to, have the worst risk scores for the most disadvantaged people once again. And so it's sort of, no matter how much good faith went into the research, it can have these really nasty downstream considerations that I think it's really important for any researcher to consider when they're publishing research and describing how that research should be taken. All right, so one ethical consideration is, what's the implication of the research that you're doing? Okay, another one of those. All right, so the final thing I'm going to talk about for ethical considerations here are questionable research practices and fraud and falsification. And we talked about these a little bit in the last semester, talking about p-hacking and omitting important information and all sorts of things that can lead studies to have results that aren't really true. And so I'm not going to rehash all of that again, but the point I want to make here is that questionable research practices also have ethical implications, because when you're putting a study out there, you're really making a statement about what is true in the world. And if you know that the steps you took to get there are a bit iffy, you have to also know that people may see the information that you're putting out into the world, and they may act on it, and it can affect policy, and it can actually affect people's lives. So in doing research, it's really, really important to, do it as best you can and to make it as good quality research as you can, rather than just trying to get it published with some finding that isn't necessarily really true. Same thing with falsification and fraud. This one I think is a bit bigger and more obvious. But research gets seen, it gets used in policy making. It affects how people see the world and the conclusions they draw. So when people totally make up research studies, that's also just a bad thing, and don't do it. But what I want to leave you with here, with that point more, is that scientific misconduct, so this is even beyond questionable research practices, would really never get picked up at all. But when we're talking about actual misconduct, so making up studies, making up data, while it's possible for falsification and fraud to be caught and for there to be consequences or for the studies to be retracted, it's often really, really hard for that to make that happen, even if you're somebody who, knows that fraud has occurred and has pretty good evidence of that being the case. And the reason for this is institutional. And there's a video linked here that I strongly, strongly recommend you guys watch, and it talks about institutional barriers to addressing scientific misconduct and fraud, and it uses an example from our very own field that happened last year. But basically, the in-house organizations in universities that oversee allegations of research misconduct. So if somebody thinks that someone has made up data, you can send it to offices of research oversight who will check it out. But they really don't have a whole lot of incentive to ever find that it's true. So from their perspective, if they find that misconduct has occurred, it's extremely embarrassing to the university and the department, to professors who are often tenured and have a lot of friends, within that department, within that, even within that office. And on the other hand, if they don't find that any fraud has occurred, nothing happens. And the, study just stays where it is, and nobody's feathers have to get ruffled, and they can just go on with their lives. So for all the times that there is alleged misconduct, again, as this video discusses and provides some more examples of, I don't want to actually point to anything or anybody, just rambling about it myself, but they show us that there are a lot of examples where scientific misconduct does make it to an Office of Research Oversight, but the allegations die there because there's so many disincentives for actually finding that any misconduct has occurred. So this means that some studies can be completely fraudulent or falsified or have findings that are fake, and even if somebody catches it, there's a good chance that it's going to stay out there as information that people will use. So just something to be aware of if you are either doing research or consuming research, that on sort of this other side of research ethics, where you're talking about the data itself, there is considerably less oversight than on the other side, where you're looking at sort of the design of the study. All right, so I said this was going to be a relatively short lecture. I'm officially done with my content here. So I'm just going to talk through the makeup and extra credit activity, and then this will be officially the last time you have to watch my talking head talk at you for 42 minutes. So for the extra credit and makeup activity, I want to go back to the beginning of the lecture and think about human subjects, ethical considerations, and what IRB boards do. So I also like going back to this one because this is the first thing we did in this class, was looking at the Zimbardo prison study. And what I found online is the IRB application from the Zimbardo prison study. So when Philip Zimbardo designed the study, he had to send it through an IRB board that would look at whether the study was ethical. And you can find the full application right there. And spoiler alert, it is not 20 pages like a modern one. So this won't take you too long to read through. And what I want you to do is pretend that you are a member of the IRB board assigned to review the study, and decide, whether you would consider the study ethical to carry out with human subjects considerations in mind. So consider each of the ethical concerns that are listed on that page at the beginning of the lecture, and decide if you think the study, violates any of those things. So voluntary participation, harm, confidentiality, deception, and so on. And then finally, I want you guys to compare the prison study IRB that you can get by clicking this link to the interventional research protocol form that's used by Rutgers. So for this one, you have to go back to that earlier slide on the PowerPoint version of the video, and click through it and see what's different. And tell me briefly, how do you think IRB expectations have changed over the last 50 or so years? 50, 71. So yep, that's it for the activity. This one again is makeup and extra credit, so you can answer each question on the previous slide with a sentence or two. If you complete the activity, it'll add 5 points to your overall grade. Whether or not you completed all the activities or not. If you completed them all, it's just 5 points of extra credit. If you didn't complete them, it's also 5 points of extra credit, but they'll make up for any previous activity. No penalty for skipping this activity. So if you have a busy week and you don't really want to sit around considering the ethical implications of the prison study for the participants, you don't have to do it. If you do choose to complete this activity, The initial post is going to be due on Thursday as usual, which is going to be the 3rd this week, and comments on 2 other students' posts will be due Sunday the 6th at 11:59 p.m. So that's all I got for you guys. I had a great semester. I hope you did too, and we will come back next week for the exam.